And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right. It is Friday, Greta, the most important day of the week, because it is the day the Heartland Institute broadcasts the Climate Realism Show. Hello there. I'm Jim Lakely. I'm the Vice President of the Heartland Institute. There is no other show like the Climate Realism Show streaming anywhere. So I hope you will like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and also leave a comment. That really helps this show get seen by more people after it's done. And you can also personally tell folks about the show. And the more the merrier on our live chats on YouTube at Rumble every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And just one quick reminder, because big tech and the legacy media do not like the way that we cover climate and energy news and policy on this program, Heartland's YouTube channel has been demonetized. So if you want to help support this program, please visit heartland.org/TCRS. That's heartland.org/TCRS. That stands for the Climate Realism Show. And help us keep making this show happen every week. Any support you can give is greatly appreciated. And we also want to thank our new streaming partners, that being junkscience.com, CFACT, and What's Up With That. These are some of the Heartland Institute's best friends on the climate realism space, and they do fantastic work, sometimes partnering with us, but often and excellently on their own to fight climate alarmism. So thank you to Junk Science, CFACT, and What's Up With That. Go find them on the internet and on social media to be better informed. So let's start the show by bringing in our fantastic panel today. We have 2 special guests that we're very excited to have together on the Climate Realism Show. First, we have Linnea Lueken. She's the Research Fellow for Energy and Environment Policy at the Heartland Institute. We also have Steve Milloy. He's the publisher of junkscience.com and the author of several best-selling books fighting climate nonsense. You can find all those on Amazon by searching for his name. And we also welcoming back to the program today, Chris Martz of CFACT. Chris is a rising senior at a university in Pennsylvania that shall go unnamed unless he wants to name it. And he is someone who has distinguished himself as a defender of actual science and data about the climate on X/Twitter. And as he recently posted, he has not yet earned his bachelor's degree, but he already has a PhD in BS detection. So, and he drives the credentialed class of climate alarmist absolutely batty every day on social media. Welcome to the show, Steve and Chris.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Very good. Very, very, very excited to have you both on here. And we have lots of people watching right now, a lot of them on X. Welcome, everybody, on Chris's fantastic X feed and also Steve's Junk Science feed. And congratulations, Chris. I think you just passed 80,000 followers, or maybe it's even 82,000 followers now.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I don't keep track of it.
Into the news. How long have you had an X account, and how did you reach such great heights and success? You seem indefatigable on social media when it comes to climate realism.
Well, I have had an account since November 2018. So that's when I really started doing all of this. It was almost 6 years ago. And I only at the beginning of the year, I only had about 20,000. And back in January of 2021, it was my account was put under the shadow ban. And I don't know why, but it was unique. And me and several other people were trying to figure out how to undo it. And what happened is that I would post something, and if you looked at my tweet and you scroll through the replies, the comment section, if you then clicked on that reply, some random person's reply to me, then my tweet, if you look above, would be hidden behind a "this tweet is unavailable" banner. And it would look like I deleted my posts, and I don't really delete posts unless I make a mistake or I just clean stuff up, gradually through, go back and just whatever, purge stuff. But it looks like people asking, why do you delete all your tweets all the time? Like, I don't. And they had the shadow ban on my account, and it was only in February, or late January, February, that it was lifted, and it finally my account just started exploding. So I've been grateful to reach so many great people, influential people, and get the word out there. It's really great.
Yeah.
And Steve also has Steve has even more followers than me, so he's done a great job getting the word out.
Well, I've been shadow banned since the beginning, so yeah.
Yeah,
Twitter,
and so has the show.
Before Musk bought Twitter, I think I was one of the few blue checks. So they gave me a blue check, but they just silenced my account. So it is what it is.
Yeah, and Steve, you're kind of a new feature on your fantastic @Junk Science account on X are some quick videos debunking. There's always lots of stuff to debunk, but people should check out your feed for some fantastic short videos that just find the day's climate nonsense and about it.
So for the past couple of months, I've been putting out. I try to do like a video a day, a minute or two on whatever's in the news that day that I've got something to say about. I think it's more interesting for me. It's more interesting for viewers, and just fun to have. And it's a good way to get the word out, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we appreciate you. We appreciate you, Chris. And we are going to appreciate, I think, as a group, one of Anthony Watts's favorite segments. By the way, Anthony Watts, usual panelist here, and as well as H. Sterling Burnett, are both on vacation this week. So that opened it up for these two gents to join us today, which is fantastic. But one of his favorite segments is the crazy climate news of the week. I call the first item, how to repel friends and annoy strangers. So the United Nations put out a tweet this week telling people, or I should say instructing people on how to discuss climate change with family and friends. And the link goes to a WikiHow page. And I guess it's a little too early for Thanksgiving dinner tips on how to talk to your crazy conservative uncle about climate change, but it's still summer barbecue season. So, when you're grabbing a beer for your Uncle Billy, you tell them that you have something to talk about, I guess. So anyway, we're going to go through this because I think it's pretty hilarious. So the United Nations, or this WikiHow, recommends, gosh, these cartoons are really cringy. Unbelievable. But tip one is find a relaxed moment to introduce the topic. There's no perfect time to talk to a loved one about climate change, but that doesn't make it any less important or necessary. If you can find a time when everyone is in a good headspace before initiating a discussion. If you or your loved one is already tense, irritated, or tired for whatever reason, you may struggle to have a productive conversation. And that also rules out ever talking to Steve Milloy about climate and if you mention climate change and your loved one immediately becomes defensive or aggressive, it may be better to return to the topic at a different time. Chris, I'm going to go to you. When I see you talk to people about climate change on Twitter, you're not using any of these tips. You seem to be a little bit more aggressive in your approach.
I am a little aggressive, but I think these people get so used to being taken seriously, and they're like, oh, well, they want you to think that they're trying to have a good faith argument, and they're not. And none of their arguments are compelling. I mean, I used to be 6-7 years ago a little bit concerned about climate change. I mean, that's everybody that has followed me for a long time knows this. I was kind of a mainstream believer in a lot of the narratives that extreme weather is the worst it's ever been, it's the hottest it's ever been, and that it's our fault and we need to do something about it. And I started looking for the data myself. I started reviewing the actual peer-reviewed literature myself, because when you actually look at the studies, they don't really echo any of these doomsday claims. They don't support any of this messaging. And so then I started looking at the IPCC report, the physical science part of which is fairly okay, as far as there's stuff to nitpick with it, but it's far better than the working group 2 or 3 reports, adaptation and policy, all those things. That's very much more partisan and one-sided versus the physical science basis. But none of these alarmists ever have a compelling argument. And I realize that they don't ever want to debate in good faith. They don't ever have anything constructive to say, nothing that's persuasive. And it's always just an appeal to authority. It's always, you're not an expert, or if you cite an expert, then they'll say that person's funded for by the fossil fuel industry, and usually that's not true. And they just dismiss everything. They dismiss any evidence that goes against their doomsday preaching. And so I don't take them seriously. I just mock them and I laugh at them, and it makes them madder than a midget in a yo-yo contest. They don't like being mocked, and it makes them mad. And so when you go offense instead of playing defense all the time, then you really start to gain ground.
Yeah. Well, you're doing it wrong, according to the United Nations, Chris. So, because tip number two,
I think somebody said in the YouTube chat that's more like how to alienate friends and family. Is if that's what the article should be called.
Immediately bring the mood down of your party that you're at by bringing up climate change.
Yeah, exactly. Right? I bet you're real fun at parties.
Yeah. So tip number two is to maintain a positive tone throughout the conversation. So Chris, you fail on that. Sorry, bud. Number three has a wonderful little cartoon here. I love how diverse all of these cartoons are as well. It says, "I'm really scared about my future." And so tip number three, Linnea, is to, Linnea or Steve, is to share the impact of climate change on your own life. For example, you may share your concerns with a statement like, "I'm really scared about my future. I'm not sure I should have kids on a planet that may not be safe for them to inhabit, which is really sad and frightening. That's why it's so important to me that I do something." Linnea, are you going to try that out at the next Labor Day weekend barbecue that you may have in your neighborhood? I mean, this just seems so weird.
I'm going to bring everyone's mood down immediately if someone tries this one on me by pointing out that you cannot say that you've proved that climate change is happening to you because you experienced a wildfire or because you are afraid of bad weather. That's, as Anthony is fond of saying, climate change has to be measured over decades, not any individual weather event. At Climate Realism, we're constantly fighting the attribution scam. So, and I know Steve is too.
Look, yeah, I don't think anyone, all these conversations scare me, especially when I see them on TV between talking heads, let alone families, because hardly anybody really knows what they're talking about to start with. They're talking about climate change. I'm pretty sure Anthony agrees with this or would agree with this. I think he's even said it. There's no one alive today has really experienced any climate change. And there's no real discernible climate change going on. Things vary from year to year. We always have bad weather, but that's not really climate change. It's just kind of weather. But everyone, has been socially conditioned to talk about this in terms of climate change. And, they really don't know what they're talking about. So all the conversations on both sides, even people who are who oppose the climate agenda often really don't know what they're talking about either. And the whole, it just tenses me up when I hear it.
Yeah. Well, there are 12 tips, believe it or not, on this, and we're certainly not going to go through all 12 of them. We'd be here for a while.
No, but you know, these tips are not meant to have a balanced conversation. These tips are meant for activists to convince family members or friends, right? That's the conceit there.
Yeah. Another thing I'd like to add is that, to Linnea and Steve's point, is that these people they always like to lecture climate skeptics or lukewarmers or whoever, or the deniers, as we're labeled, that extreme weather, or they say that when it's cold outside, when there's a snowstorm, a skeptic will say, "Look, it's snowing. Global warming is a hoax." And then the activist will say, "Well, the weather's not climate. A single day doesn't disprove the long-term trend." Then they'll turn around and they'll blame the next heat wave, the next wildfire, flood, drought, whatever, hurricane on climate change. And obviously the rules that they establish, do not apply to them. And you can call them hypocrites. They understand they're hypocrites and they don't care. But the thing that I want to point out is that climate, and this is, since I'm a meteorology major, this is my background, I fight this extreme weather event attribution, these claims all the time. That's basically my entire feat. And climate change is an outcome. It's not a cause. Climate's not fuel. Climate does not cause specific events to happen. Dr. Roger Pilkey Jr. made a great argument on this. He did a whole article on this on a Substack page where he said a baseball A baseball player's batting average does not cause individual hits. A lot of things can change his individual or his hitting performance, but a change in the average does not change the hitting performance. That's a change in an outcome, change is not a cause.
Right. Yeah. Before we leave the subject though, Chris, we were talking right before we came on the air, and maybe Linnea can also have some thought on this. I'm sure she does. We get asked a lot by people in the comments on this show. How do we deprogram Gen Z and America's youth? Because we point out the obvious on this show a lot, that multiple generations of Americans and all around the world have been brainwashed and indoctrinated into climate alarmism. People like you, Chris, and Linnea. And I mean, I talk to people in my own life that are in their 50s, like me, that have been still brainwashed, and they're just passively concerned about the climate, if not apoplectic about it. So maybe, Chris, you could share a little bit about your experience, speaking to people since you're still in college, of your generation about this, and are we being too doom and gloom? Am I wrong that your generation has been just completely brainwashed and cannot be convinced out of it?
That's a good question. A lot of people ask me that, especially because I'm young and I'm 21. So a lot of people ask me that question about my college experience, and a lot of people in my major, in my actual program, are very much in agreement with me. Some of them maybe were on the fence before, but they read my stuff. They see the evidence that I present. They see the idiots that I have to deal with on Twitter that just come after me. They never make a constructive argument. They never come up with an evidence, data-backed rebuttal to anything that I say. They just appeal to authority, personal attacks. They criticize my credentials or lack thereof right now, or they'll criticize somebody like Dr. Judith Curry or Happer because they don't go with the mainstream climate narrative. And people that are my age, that have the critical thinking skill set, they can see that these people have nothing of substance to add, and they're like, maybe what Chris is saying, he has a point. And so a lot of people read my stuff in my college, and not everybody agrees with me. It's probably a 60-40 split, 60 towards my favor, probably. But a lot of people are open-minded. Now, I find that when I go to other people, like if I go to party with people up at Penn State, because I go to Penn State with my friends and we do karaoke at the college bars all the time and stuff. And if I happen to get in a conversation with somebody that's my age about just whatever is going on in the world, and they ask what I do, and I tell them, a lot of them are in agreement. So I think a lot of Gen Z is starting to, and a lot of them begin to realize that, especially after the pandemic, the junk science that went into shutting down their social lives. And I think the pandemic and also the inflation crisis we have right now are really starting to turn the tide in my generation. Then again, there's still a lot of people that are very much for this stuff, that are very acting hysterical about it. I actually have a shirt that I bought online that says "I heart global warming," and I wore it around campus just to see people's reactions. I got a lot of fist bump from people, boys and girls alike in my age. But this one girl with purple hair, of course, what a surprise. She comes up to me and she goes, "I don't like your shirt." I said, I don't care what you think. And I just continued walking. But a lot of people in my generation actually seem to be really changing their minds about this. And I think it has to do with the fact that they see this green energy scam, if you will, as a way to increase your cost of living, especially with all the inflation we have now. Their social lives were ruined by COVID. They see that it was about control, and there's a lot of shoddy science that went into that. And I think they see a lot of parallels between climate science and pandemic science. And but I see that the generation that seems to be more concerned about this are the millennials, especially as young scientists that are in their 30s and 40s whose careers depend on this climate funding, and they want to be famous and they want to have notoriety and they want to save the world. They want to be heroes. They don't actually care about understanding the dynamics that govern the atmosphere like I do.
Excellent. Anything to add to that, Linnea?
No, he's pretty much got it all. I've had mixed experiences. I find that when talking to women my age, so like older 20s into early 30s, women in particular aren't very skeptical about climate alarmist stuff in general. But I think that might just be like I don't know, people going along to get along. They don't want they don't want to rock the boat or anything. But I think if you pushed people on it and, you know, gave them kind of the rattling off questions to really get them to think about what it is that they're claiming, I think that helps. But yeah, I mean, I think that considering the amount of effort that has gone into brainwashing my generation and younger generations into climate alarm, they're not getting their money's worth, I don't think, despite what the media makes it look like. The fact that like I had entire classes or my entire like 7th grade was all of my classes were angled towards teaching us about global warming or whatever, and someone like me popped out of that. It was yeah, they're not getting their money's worth, I don't think. But there's definitely a lot of people our age who are worried about this stuff, and especially like really little kids right now seem to be particularly affected. But it's because, you know, when you're a little kid and your kindergarten teacher or whatever tells you that the world only has like 5 years left to survive, or 10 years or whatever it will be next year, you know, that's going to affect you because you don't have the critical thinking skills. You only react to what adults tell you. Once people grow up a bit, though, I think that they start to see that it's not quite that simple.
Yeah. For sure. Well, that's very encouraging. And, you know, polls do show that despite all of this indoctrination and constant propaganda, that they should be winning this a lot more. And polls show that it's at the very least, at best for them, I should say 50-50 on whether people would classify themselves as an alarmist or a realist. So, all right, speaking of a climate realist, we're going to play a couple of videos here. Donald Trump he gave a press conference yesterday in New Jersey. You know, he has to give a press conference because otherwise the media will not cover his campaign. They have to be forced into it. But Steve and I and a few others were texting during his press conference when he got to a bit where he riffed about the Green New Deal and what a scam it was. It is a sop to the green energy leeches. And he also talked about the impracticality of electric trucks, you know, the long haul kind. And I thought it would be good to play these and comment on them because you probably won't see them on the mainstream media. And I think it also, you know, in my opinion, is that in 2 short clips, he did a better job of explaining how the Green New Deal is a scam and the impracticality of electric vehicle long haul trucks that I've ever heard from anybody. So, Andy, why don't we pop up that Green New Deal video, please?
Look, they're not giving millions and millions of dollars to politicians because they like their policy. They're giving it because they made deals. They're going to take over lots of different things in our country. They're going to build windmills as an example. They're going to build big solar fields that take up half the desert, massive solar fields. And I'm a big fan of solar, but it can't fire our plants. It's not going to fire our plants. Fire up those plants. We got to get them going. And the only thing that can do that is fossil fuel right now. And the only thing that can make electricity, which we all want, is right now fossil fuel and nuclear. And nuclear has its place, a very big place in our country, very big place. China is going with nuclear. France has been going with nuclear for many years.
Yeah, Steve, that was you know, basically laying out the scam, and that the only reason this is supported, of course they support it because everybody's making money on it, well, except the consumer.
Yeah, no, he's got a really, you know, a extremely deep understanding. He understands, you know, climate idiocy, hoax at its core. I mean, he was one of the first people to call it a hoax. And he has maintained that. I don't think his campaign will let him use the word hoax. But anytime he starts talking about this, he might as well be a donor to the Heartland Institute or something. I mean, he's great. He had that conversation with Musk earlier in the week, and you know, I don't know many politicians that can sit down with a major donor like Elon and not kowtow to him on everything. I mean, Trump, you know, Elon tried to work on him on climate science, and Trump just, you know, politely sat there and ignored it. I think was fantastic. And so and then Elon is forced to babble about, you know, carbon dioxide making it hard for people to breathe, which is totally crazy. I mean, the guy's so far out of his depth. And, you know, Trump is just he's amazing. In my view, he's the greatest president of all time. We need him back, and he gets this issue. He knows what it's all about. He understands that science is junk. He understands that the Chinese are using it against us. That there's all sorts of corruption. That this green technology doesn't work. I mean, he understands it soup to nuts.
Yep. Let me. I want to play the other clip, and then we'll let Chris and Linnea jump in here for both of these videos. But this was about electric trucks, and when Trump kind of riffs and goes off script, you can tell he has prepared things. Sometimes people are really, they get kind of nervous. They don't know where he's going to go. But he went off on I think a really good riff on this one, and he just tells a story that explains to you why EVs suck, which he pretty much told Elon Musk to his face in that interview the other day. So play electric trucks for us, Andy.
He said, for 50 years I've been buying, and every single year they got better, more efficient, stronger. He said, if they make us buy electric trucks, we will go back 70 years because the truck is worse than the one we had 50 years ago. And he said, I won't partake in it. They want the truckers, the trucking industry to do that. One other thing, the truck is heavier and the battery is much larger than the tanks. And the battery would take up about half of the payload. Think of that. But just as importantly, the battery and all that goes into electric is much heavier. The truck it weighs 2.5 times more than a normal truck fired up by diesel. And he said, if that's the case, sir, you would have to rebuild every single bridge and road in America because the weight is so enormous. It wouldn't be able to go on the bridges and all of the different weight-bearing roads in America. I said, did you explain this to the people? I mean, a 5-year-old child, if he was hearing these things, it doesn't go far. It takes too much room. You don't have any room left for anything. It's almost the whole thing would be carrying a battery. Does anybody explain this to these people? We do explain it. They know it very well. At the end of the meeting, they say, we don't care. Just start making your electric truck. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it, he said. So we're going to repeal all that. We're going
Linnea, you were the one who's smiling the most during that, so you get to start off first. But in my mind, I have not heard a public figure, let alone a politician, explain all of those downsides and the impracticalities of turning everything into electric than Donald Trump was able to do in 60 seconds.
Yeah, I just love the way he does it, and the way that he explains this stuff at such a common level. Because we talk about this stuff all the time on this show, and as people who are neck deep in the policy and in the science on these issues, sometimes you can get a little bit heady, I think, about it. You can get a little bit wordy, but Trump just cuts all of that out. He goes, look, you can't go far. You can't, the battery weighs too much. It'll take up half your payload. It's too big. And it's not as good as they have advertised. I would love to see his take on talking about like the electric snow plows in New York that they've tried a couple times to implement, and they've just been a disaster every time. Trump summed it up perfectly. I have nothing that I can add that would make it better.
I'm on the same front with that. I think Linnea and Steve both kind of nailed, and Trump nailed that point pretty clearly.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that people, I guess it's starting to come up now. What is the percentage of electric vehicles? I mean, obviously there aren't any real, to any scale, any real electric long haul trucks out there. But, 5 years ago, you barely saw any electric vehicles. Now, you do see them. I don't know, was it 1%, 3% of them on the road? And there's been hardly any conversation about how much the roads can handle. The fact that these vehicles are much, much heavier than a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle. And, since you don't pay gas taxes because you plug it in, how are you going to, compensate for the destruction these can wreak on roads and bridges? No one's ever talked about that, but Trump just brought it up and it made so much sense.
One thing he should have brought up was the charging times that it takes to charge. If you're the lines, the amount of people that are waiting to get their EVs charged, especially as truckers. It's going to take even longer. So I think Trump should have brought that up. But other than that, I think he did a pretty fantastic job just breaking it down very quickly.
Yeah, and he could also bring up the subsidies. Without the subsidies, none of this stuff would exist. No one would buy this stuff. Few people. Right. I mean, maybe rich people would buy some fancy Teslas, but that's about it.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why Elon Musk was asked when he endorsed Donald Trump. He was asked on Twitter like that very day. It's like, oh well, he's against electric vehicles, and that's kind of weird. And Elon said it wouldn't affect my business because he knows he has a niche luxury electric vehicle. He's not trying to be Ford or Chevy and making parking lots full of electric vehicles that nobody wants because they're not up to his standards. So, that makes total perfect sense. And we have not, I mean, we rip on electric vehicles on this show quite a bit, because they're easy to rip on. They tend to spontaneously combust. There was a big fire in South Korea that we covered last week on these sorts of things. If you love an electric vehicle, God bless you. But the problem is that they are subsidized by taxpayers and they are being basically mandated by government regulation. And that is something that nobody who believes in freedom should be getting behind. So
all these gas taxes are increasing people's cost of living, and it's deliberate to try and coerce you into abandoning your traditional internal combustion engine vehicle and buy an EV. It's all part of their Green New Deal, plan.
Yep, 100%. All right. Another item here that I think we may do a whole show on this in the future, but this is a pretty important report that came out from our friends at the American Energy Institute. So it's basically climate alarmists have been whispering into the ears of judges to rig the courts in favor of their side on a climate alarmist lawsuit. So the story here is from Fox News. Corruptly influencing the courts, climate justice group that trains federal judges under scrutiny. So this was a report put out by a friend of this show, actually, Jason Isaac of the American Energy Institute. He's been on before, a friend of Steve's as well. So let me just get into this a little bit, and maybe Steve can put it in some context for us. But this new report by the American Energy Institute sounds the alarm on a legal training program that it says is, quote, corruptly influencing the courts and destroying the rule of law to promote climate cult alarmism. The new report by AEI alleges that the Environmental Law Institute's Climate Judiciary Project is, quote, falsely portraying itself as a neutral entity, teaching judges about questionable climate science. The report also alleges that the Climate Judiciary Project is a partner with more than 24 public plaintiffs suing energy providers to hold them liable for supposed damages, resulting from climate change effects. To date, the CJP has trained more than 2,000 state and federal judges, according to the report. Yeah. Jason Isaac, our friend here, says that this is, quote, really like interfering with the referees before a match and before a game. Let me just mention this here, Steve, before throwing it to you. So Nick Collins, who's a spokesperson for the Environmental Law Institute, which created the Climate Judiciary Project, said that Jason Isaac's report is, quote, full of misinformation. And he says that we are just a bunch of nonpartisans and just, quote, give mainstream evidence-based scientific curriculum to these judges. Oh, and he also adds that all of their funding, because it's a nonprofit group, just like the Heartland Institute, all of their funding comes from, quote, individuals, foundations, government agencies, and energy companies, which is pretty interesting, but says that none of those people dictate our work. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a soft spot or a sore spot for me because the Heartland Institute and Steve's nonprofit as well is often attacked mercilessly by the environmental left for supposedly swimming in big oil money and doing their bidding in the public square as if, my God, that'd be great. I could even afford an electric vehicle if that was the case. But here on the other side, I'm not imputing bad motives to the Environmental Law Institute based on who their donors are, but they always do it the other way. So anyway, Steve, I probably went on too long, but maybe you can put this whole thing into context, because I know that you keep a very close eye on all of the lawsuits that are going on out there. Crazy people suing oil companies and cities for not protecting the environment for future generations, stuff like that.
Well, so I will impute bad motives to the Environmental Law Institute. It's a 501c3. It's been around for I don't know, 30, 40 years, maybe a little bit longer. And as a 501c3, it can only educate. It cannot, lobby on, do issue lobbying, for example. And, here, so it would be okay if the Environmental Law Institute was having judges in and teaching them how the Clean Air Act worked or how the Clean Water Act worked or something like that. I know that, there's a Federal Judiciary Center which teaches judges a little bit about science in a very generic way. But here, if you look at this curriculum, it's not really, I mean, it's a loaded curriculum, and everything is like, you're going to come across the climate issue because fossil fuels are destroying the planet. So, what they're doing is influencing the judges to believe that climate is this catastrophe that they have this moral, if not legal, obligation to put an end to. And it's why you see, in these lawsuits about like various drilling projects, for example, judges are concerned about the emissions from the project. Well, they imagine that because they've been incorrectly trained to imagine that every emission is a problem, even though the emissions are really, even if you buy into climate hoax science, the emissions are trivial, and any one project doesn't really matter. But they're like, any emission is a problem, and that's just not so. Even if you believe the opposite of what we believe, so. And the Environmental Law Institute knows all this. It knows what it's doing. It's why it gets the money from its donors to do this. I mean, they're brainwashing judges, and they're giving judges that are inclined to think their way, Democrat-appointed judges, leftist judges. They're giving them ammunition for when they write their decisions. And I think it's illegal, unethical. It's legal malpractice. It's awful.
All right. That's you can contact Steve Milloy at Junk Science on Twitter. That's where to send all the nasty direct messages to Steve Milloy. But yeah, I mean, it's not your generation necessarily, Chris. Although these lawsuits, I think there was one in Utah. There was one in Montana. Maybe one in Hawaii, Oregon, I think is certainly one of them, where the children are suing the previous generations for ruining the planet for them, ruining the climate for them by, I don't know, driving around in trucks like you have, or maybe lighting campfires or using coal-fired energy and all this sort of stuff. So, these things, do matter. And as Steve pointed out, I can only imagine if CFAC, for whom you work, was whispering in the ears of judges to make sure that that the results come out the way you want. It would be a national scandal, but I guess it's just fine if it's the environmental left doing it.
Yeah, it's the oil companies and CFAC, Heartland, all of us get accused of influencing, policy as against their narrative, but then these people can whisper that they want the judge results or the jury their rulings to come out in their favor, and so they're hypocritical. But again, if you point that out to them, they don't care. They understand they're hypocrites, but they don't care.
Right. Well, Linnea, you're a former, I guess once a petroleum engineer, always a petroleum engineer. So you can't run away from that. One day you may be in the in the hawk for contributing to climate change. So yeah, get your lawyers in order.
I'm the only one here who got any paycheck from big oil at any point in time.
You earned it though.
Not when I worked at Heartland though.
That's exactly
all of it went away when I quit my old job and went to work for Heartland. Sorry, I was laughing too much at the thought of that. What was your actual question, Jim?
Oh no, I was just making a joke that you should probably make sure that your lawyer's on speed dial because they might come for you, considering you used to work for the industry.
Oh yeah, nope. That's what was it? A few months back when they were talking about how they want to put people in jail for climate denial or whatever, and then there's that climate criminals group that's popped up recently. I think all of this is baddie. They're not gonna do it, but it does make you think. It does make you stop and think. Would I be willing to go to jail for promoting so-called climate denial? And my answer is yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna sit in front of my computer or in front of a judge and say, actually, I recant everything that I believe is true. I'm gonna pretend like I don't notice the data that yeah, sure. I guess if it becomes illegal to be a so-called denier, then I'll go to jail. I don't care. Go ahead.
Well, the whole concept of jail is whether you're willing to or not. Your will has nothing to do with it. So
yeah.
Get used to it.
No, I'm just saying I'm not gonna fold under the pressure of the threat of jail. Yeah.
That's interesting is that I'll always love the big oil talking point that alarmists bring up anytime that you challenge their creed. And oil companies a lot of them are involved in expanding into renewable energy projects. They profit off of this because they realize that they're not just coal, oil, and natural gas companies. They're energy companies, Exxon, BP, all of them. So the kind of you're funded by big oil or you're a shill for big oil isn't really a talking point that really has any claws in the ground anymore. It doesn't really. It's just kind of a talking point. It doesn't actually have any substance to it at all whatsoever.
Exactly, and actually, if you look at the charitable giving of these big corporations, I know Shell has a charitable foundation. I'm sure all the big oil companies have charitable foundations. It takes you 4 seconds to Google it and look up and see where they're donating, and they're all into environmental justice. They're all contributing to these green groups. They're not giving money to the Heartland Institute or to CFAC or other places.
Look, I mean, they also profit off all the hysteria. They use regulations to weaken smaller competitors, which they can then buy up. They're destroying the small independent fracking industry so that they can buy it and better control the price of oil, because the small independent frackers destroyed big oil's pricing abilities 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And they're trying to recapture that. And you're seeing it now with the big mergers. The oil companies are buying their smaller rivals. And, we're getting back to the day where it's big oil versus OPEC, and OPEC is really in charge, and big oil can surf that and have bigger profits from that. Donald Trump wants to bring us back to where, the small guys have a chance, and that'll destroy the pricing power of OPEC and big oil.
Yeah. Well, I want to point out too, the American Petroleum Institute, the API, lobbies for carbon taxes. It blows my mind when people try to say that it's all the greens versus big oil. Big oil is in your pocket. What are you talking about?
Anytime I see I pull up YouTube to watch a political video or a comedy video, whatever I'm watching on YouTube, there's always an ad from Exxon Mobil that talks about, or Shell, or one of these big oil companies talks about a cleaner future, and they want to invest in wind and solar projects. And as Steve said, it profits them, but it hurts the smaller oil companies. It hurts the little man. But the big oil companies have nothing to lose from this. They have actually financial gains.
Yep.
So that's a good. I'm glad Steve brought that up. That was a great point.
Well, they know the reality that they're not going to stop using fossil fuels. There is no energy transition. It's just not happening. So
it just increases energy consumption. You add more to the grid, solar or wind. It just increases energy prices. Doesn't actually reduce. It doesn't offset anything, because these headlines always come out every. I'm sure Steve sees this all the time. I'm sure all you have seen it. They'll say, "Well, wind powered 67% of the UK's grid last weekend." But it's the minimum metric that matters, because you have to be able to guarantee a certain amount, which is the minimum. What is the minimum guarantee? So if you guarantee, if the average is 14, but you can only guarantee 2%, then you can only get rid of 2% of your fossil fuel infrastructure to power the grid. So you cannot take whatever amount off, like 43% off to, or 30, I don't know, whatever the math is, but you can, sorry, that was really bad.
No, but
you cannot replace, the point is that they're not replacing the grid. They're just increasing consumption, increasing your cost of living. That's all it boils down to. There's no transition.
Yep. All right, let's move on. I know we're going to be quickly running out of show here, but that's okay. It's been very fun and very lively conversation. If you do have questions, we will field them. Linnea is keeping an eye out in the chat, so we'll be getting those later. Chris, I wanted to point out a couple of your tweets. It seems like you've been focused lately on pushing back on the idea that we've experienced unprecedented heat this summer. So you started to put your PhD in BS detection at work on this subject. So why don't you run us through what you see on the screen with your first tweet and image?
Yeah, could you zoom in on that tweet so I can read it? I don't remember what I wrote exactly. Yeah, so thank you. Back in June, we had this heat wave in the eastern United States. It's been in my part of the country. It's been a pretty hot summer compared to what we've seen in the last 10 years. But it's the heat we've seen is not at any means unprecedented. So the press keeps running headlines about this unprecedented. This is the hottest. The summers are getting hotter. They're getting more extreme. Blah 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 blah. But if you actually look at the actual number of really hot days ever above 95, 100, 105 degrees, they have been declining since 1895 in the United States. I did an analysis of 1,218 United States historical climatology network stations, and the average number of days per year from those stations reaching 95 degrees was 18% lower during the 60-year period, 1961 to 2020, than it was during the 60-year period, 1901 to 1960. So there's been a huge decrease in the number of extremely hot days in the United States. And if you look at this map here, which I got from the Weather Bell reanalysis on the CDOS temperature page, the summer temperatures in the lower 48 have really been about average, maybe slightly above the mean relative to 1991 to 2020 this summer. It's been a little hot in the I-95 corridor from, say, Richmond, Virginia, all the way up to Boston. And it's been kind of hot in the Southwest compared to what's normal. But most of the country, especially in the Heartland from the Continental Divide to the Mississippi River, even into the Ohio, Tennessee River valleys, it's been really about average, what you'd expect temperature-wise this summer. I've had a lot of followers down in Texas say it's not been a hot summer at all compared to what we've had the last couple of years. And you can see there's some blue contours over Texas, which means below average temperatures. The worst heat waves we've had in this country were in the 1930s and in the 1950s by far, and also the 1910s and 1980s. The most recent, really extremely excruciatingly hot summer we've had in the entire country overall was back in 2012. And summers in the U.S. are hot. They always have been. They always will be. Some are hotter than others. That's just how it is. But we've also had this claim that we had the hottest day ever. And this claim, that was back in a couple weeks ago, it was the hottest day on Earth ever. And the records for that only go back to 1940. And they used the ERA5 reanalysis from the Copernicus ECMWF, which runs the European weather forecast model. This ERA5 reanalysis only goes back 84 years. And reanalysis is where you take model data, or you take some observations that you've had scattered around, and you create a comprehensive global picture of weather on a 6-hourly basis. So 6, 12, 18, 24. For each day, going back to 1940 for this particular data set. But this reanalysis, you get the observations, and then you fill in any gaps with models, and they run it like a forecast. So this isn't actual observations. Most of it's just interpolated computer model data. It is not actually stuff that's measured. So there's no point. There's no credence to their point that it's the hottest day ever. And they say that they can get it down to the nearest 100th of a degree Celsius. They go out 2 decimal places. You cannot get that precise, even with if you have a thermometer network that's spatially distributed evenly with all the thermometers placed evenly apart. You cannot get a global average temperature down to that precision. Even getting it down to 1/10 of a degree is very challenging. So it's very skeptical. And even if it was the hottest day, say I shouldn't even say hottest, 17 degrees Celsius is not hot by any measure. Say it's the warmest or mildest day ever since 1940. Okay, but the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And you ask these people, well, if you believe that's the case, then what was the temperature in 7,546 BC on this exact date? And they can't tell you, and they'll block you.
You don't
say. They can model it, Chris.
Yeah. Oh boy. There's some fun stuff. Let's just tinker with the computer and get whatever result I'm making fun of it. Fine.
Yeah, right.
I'll take donations.
Yeah. Well, actually, I saw somebody in the chat asked, I think it's a good contemporary question. Billy Ruck said, I'll bring it up there, Linnea. How are global average temperatures calculated exactly? Y'all should do a show on that, and maybe we will. I know you talk all the time. You say this on your Twitter feed a lot, Steve, that there is no such thing as global average temperature. It's not really something that has any meaning.
Yeah, it has no physical meaning. It's a something invented for the climate hoax. When you think about it, at any given moment, you've got the polar areas and you've got the tropics. And what's the global temperature? Where would you take it? The Earth is 196 million square miles. The troposphere is 12 miles high. At the equator, 6 miles high. At the poles, I think I calculated, just estimated, like 1.7 billion cubic miles. Where do you stick the thermometer? You know, Al Gore says the Earth has a fever. Well, you know, you can see if a person has a fever because whether you stick the thermometer, you know, in their ear, in their mouth, in their rear end, under their armpits, you know, you're going to get 98.6 degrees. That's the average temperature, but you can't do that with the Earth. So the whole thing is just nonsensical.
But how do they calculate it anyway? Does anyone know?
How do they calculate the average global temperature?
I would say to that point, you could calculate a global average temperature. I mean, Roy Spencer does it with the satellites and stuff, and I think that's the best measure we have. It's the most accurate. But again, it doesn't, as Steve said, it doesn't really have any physical mean. You can calculate the average phone number in a phone book, but it doesn't mean anything.
Right. Well, yeah.
Regional, you know, the average. I'm not gonna. Never mind. I'll skip. I'm gonna go somewhere with that, but I'm just gonna not. But the point is that not for this show, but the point is that you can calculate it, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have any like quantitative value that's useful for climate impacts. That's why there's no actual data, no metric that indicates that we are in a climate crisis. You look at the number of extreme weather events; they've either been unchanged or they're going down in most cases in terms of their frequency and intensity. You look at the amount of people living in poverty, the amount of people with the access to electricity, the amount of people that are dying from extreme weather events. It's all better than it ever has been, largely thanks to our adaptation skills and our technologies, obviously. But there's no indication. The term climate crisis is a political distinction, and it is in reference to how climate change supposedly negatively impacts society and people. And there's no data that indicates that that's the case. So it just the idea of a crisis it exists under this idea of global average temperature. That's the control knob, they say, of human welfare. But there's no indication really that it is. If anything, a colder climate is better, is worse for people than the warmer climate. Historically, warm periods are called climate optimums, not global warming disasters. So the regional climate matters. I feel the temperature is like in the mid 80s here in Virginia right now, but I don't know what the temperature is. If the temperature is over 100 in Phoenix right now, I don't know what it is in Phoenix at the moment, but I don't feel the temperature in Phoenix. So I can calculate the average temperature between Phoenix and here, but it doesn't really mean anything because what I feel is local. And Dr. Roger Pilkey Sr., who is a meteorologist, the father of Pilkey Sr., the policy guy, Senior was talking to me about this privately. Regional climate matters much more than the global climate picture, but climate alarmists believe it's the global climate that matters.
Well, it's the metric they have, and you know, you see these graphs from NOAA going all the way back to 1880. Well, if you look at, you know, what is the 1880 global temperature? Well, it's calculated based on about 800 temperature stations, mostly in the U.S. and Europe, few in Australia, and a couple others scattered around the world. You can't legitimately estimate a global temperature, even if you were to buy into that concept. You cannot legitimately estimate that with those few temperature stations, especially that distribution of temperature stations. And then now today, you know, like Michael Mann and the hockey stick, you know, he mishmashed tree ring proxies with thermometer data. So now we're mishmashing thermometer data with satellite estimates and computer modeling. It's all garbage. It's all garbage.
The data splicing, when you have, even if it's the same kind of metric that you're measuring, if you have two different methods for measuring the data, you cannot, it's scientifically unethical to splice that together. And the reconstruction that from the hockey stick actually showed cooling after during the instrumental period of record where it shows warming, and they just lopped that off and they just tagged on the instrumental record that shows warming, and so it's data splicing. You cannot do that.
And then there's a guy I know named Anthony Watts, and he's done this review of surface stations, and 96% of them are not accurate to within a degrees Celsius, which is almost all of it global warming. And if you look around the world, I think 80% of UK temperature stations are not precise within 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. I mean, the data is just a nightmare. And I'm sure that, if the data in the United States and the UK suck, you can only imagine what it is for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Dr. Willie Soon actually sent me a study. We were emailing back and forth. And there was a study that came out that shows they estimate that 40% of U.S. warming, I think it's probably more than that, that shows that the 40% of warming in the United States alone is due to the urban heat island effect. Yeah. And that was a pretty recent study. So
you can see it in all the graphs, because there's more warming as you get later in the 20th century and 21st century, and that's urban heat island. I mean, we have since 1975 we have doubled the population.
It's even more than that, Steve. In the U.S. climate state by state reports that they put out, I can't remember the exact name of the
state climate summaries from NOAA.
Right, the state climate summaries. They show most of them, unless it's really egregious, and then they leave the chart off, which is always funny because I always go and find the chart. But the fact of the matter is, in every single one of those state summaries, the average warming of the state is not coming from daytime highs, but higher nighttime lows.
Right.
And there's multiple reasons for it.
And also winter temperatures. It's all urban heat island.
Yeah. You could say it's junk science, Steve.
What's that?
In rural.
You could say it's junk science, couldn't you, Steve?
You could say
that. you may say that, yes.
Someone should have a website.
In some places, there's been warming overnight and in winter with the rural areas, and a lot of that has to do with the corn sweat, increased crop yields, especially from the evapotranspiration. Tony Howard has talked about this a lot. And I used to play. My best friend growing up lived out in the country where nearby I live, but there's a cornfield across from his house, and we used to go and play manhunt in the cornfield in the middle of July. And over where by the pond, where in his house, it'd be much cooler, much less humid than in the cornfield. It'd be a lot warmer, higher dew point, much more, much warmer. So when we play manhunt in the cornfield and chase our friends around and play it. So anybody that ever has been in a cornfield at night knows it doesn't cool off as much as as surroundings that are more forested or open surroundings, especially in the valley. And it's the same thing that happens in the city pretty much, although the city is much more higher magnitude.
Okay. Well, hey, we're going to, our producer extraordinaire, Andy, reminded me that we have a title card for this show, and it's called We Are Not at a Climate Tipping Point, and we have not gotten to that topic yet. So since it's on the title card, we should probably hit it. That's a fascinating discussion. I really hope the audience is enjoying this show, because I think it's been a fantastic conversation so far. So there's this story that was from the New York Times, a little special feature called How Close Are the Planet's Climate Tipping Points? Earth's warming could trigger sweeping changes in the natural world that would be hard, if not impossible, to reverse. It's very snazzy, and it's very alarmist, and it's very panicky, and it's also very false, verifiably false, which we can probably cover very quickly right here. This is the kind of alarmism that you see in the media every day. This is why this show exists. This is why the Heartland Institute is very busy every day of the week. This is why we have a website called Climate Realism, because it's to push back on these very things. And these are just so easy to debunk. It's almost not a challenge. I mean, the first one here is the mass death of coral reefs. When corals go ghostly white, they aren't necessarily dead, and the reefs are necessarily gone forever. But too much heat in the water causes the corals to expel the symbiotic algae living inside their tissues. And in time, they may come back if conditions improve. Steve, I was talking to you about this yesterday. It's like this story came out. This was published, I think, literally the day before or 2 days before. There was a story about how the Great Barrier Reef off of Australia was at its largest extent ever. And, this is one of the great alarm stories that we are destroying the Great Barrier Reef. And it comes out the day before that that's not true. So,
well, just sort of 2 points. So Joanne Nova had this great graph on her website. I think the Great Barrier Reef has hit new records in coral extent for the last 3 years, which includes the two, hottest years ever. Number one, number two, the hot water it's not caused by global warming. It's the
Right.
sun and maybe some geothermal heating. It's just not physically possible for the atmosphere to make the water hot, make the oceans hot. It's just not possible. So the
Right.
whole story is just ridiculous.
Yeah. I knew that would trigger you. Look at you. You're getting angry. It's all right.
Corals
Go ahead.
first evolved on Earth 540 million years ago during the Cambrian expansion, when temperatures were about 10 degrees Celsius higher than they are today. And the global carbon dioxide level was about 7,000 parts per million, which is 0.4 times higher than it is today, roughly. So this idea that we are killing the coral reefs from our carbon dioxide emissions and global warming is just nonsense. Corals thrive in warmer water. They can come under heat stress. That's true, but there was actually some evidence that coral reef, especially in the Caribbean, maybe not Australia, in the Caribbean, there was a lot of coral bleaching during the Little Ice Age. Actually, in I think it was the 1750s or 1780s, somewhere in one of those decades. There was a study that came out. I'd have to link to it. I came across it the other day, but there was high coral bleaching in the Caribbean Sea during the Little Ice Age, during the depths of it. So that obviously was not caused by global warming. There was obviously other factors. Some shallow reefs, what happens is that they're shallow, that means they're only just below the surface of water. Changes in sea level due to changes in El Nino, La Nina, those interannual variations can reduce the sea level and expose them to open air and increased ultraviolet radiation exposure. Still waters, where it's not there's not a lot of wind, so the water kind of just stagnates, increases the amount of radiation coming into the water. And UV is harmful to coral reefs, a lot of it, and so a lot of that just happens naturally. And also, humans do affect coral reef health negatively, significantly, especially in hot, but not due to global warming, but due to toxic chemicals to reefs that are in sunscreens, the non-mineral based sunscreens. There's plenty of research on this. There's a coral reef near the resorts in Acapulco, Mexico, and Quintana Roo, and the reef's dying there because of all the sunscreen that the tourists and the snorkelers, it gets into the water, into the corals, kills them, bleaches them. But there's a reef in Cozumel just 20 miles across the way that's doing perfectly fine, and they don't have that much of a problem. So obviously it's not CO2, it's not global warming that's really killing the corals. It's a lot of other factors that go into this.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's hit a couple of these other ones. I'm going to skip over the abrupt falling of permafrost for now. I want to go over to the collapse of Greenland ice. Linnea, if people go to Heartland's YouTube page, they can see the series of Climate at a Glance videos. One of them that we released last week was on this very subject. So why don't you explain to us how the collapse of Greenland ice is hardly imminent?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one that's been claimed for probably about 20 years now, is that Greenland is imminently going to be ice-free in the summers, at least, and Arctic ice in general is going to be gone in summers. That continues to not happen. There is a gradual decline in ice extent during summer months, especially, but it's not an apocalyptic scenario, when you compare the ice loss that we've seen, which looks really bad when they plot it on graphs by itself, when you compare that to the total ice mass of the sheet itself, it's like barely anything. You can't even see the change on the chart. It's once again just being hyped like crazy. And also, if we are leaving a glacial period, you should not be surprised by ice loss. Okay. Right. Like Chicago, the area that Jim lives was under like feet of ice at one point.
A mile of ice, I think.
You more than, yeah. So you should not be concerned about that in terms of like, is this unprecedented? It obviously isn't. So yeah, no, I would not be too alarmist over that. I'm trying to be quick.
Okay, and speaking of ice, they also hear that another supposed tipping point is the breakup of the West Antarctic ice. This is another thing they've been predicting for decades and decades. I know Steve is kind of an expert on collecting ancient news clippings of these sorts of predictions that have not come true for literally 50 years. But what about the Antarctic ice melt that is supposedly imminent, and then we're all going to die?
Yeah, so there's been no cooling, or I'm sorry, there's been no warming in the West Antarctic ice sheet for 25 years. So there's volcanic activity underneath.
Right.
People have said that, this is where the Doomsday Glacier is, the Thwaites Glacier, which Rolling Stone writer nicknamed Doomsday Glacier. And I guess he said he predicted that, or somebody predicted that the Doomsday Glacier, if it broke off, would raise sea levels by meters. And I think, if it ever happens, more accurate predictions are like millimeters. So it's just, that's one of those places where not many people know much about, but that doesn't stop alarmists from just making stuff up.
Yeah. And we're going to get to questions here in a minute, but one of the other points was the loss of the Amazon rainforest, which of course has nothing to do with CO2 emissions or human emissions of any kind. It's because farmers are clearing the forest to do agriculture or ranching. If you don't want that to happen, Brazil should probably do something about it, but we're not going to. Changing to electric cars isn't going to change the Amazon rainforest at all. I don't care what Sting says. That's an old reference. Sting used to be big on saving the Amazon rainforest. Only Steve and I probably remember that. So
yeah, I remember that. Right. Yeah, look. No one. If you look at NASA satellite photos, yeah, there's a little bit of decline in the greening in the Amazon, but there's a lot of greening, more than enough greening to make up for it. No one really understands the carbon cycle that well in the Amazon. It's a small part of the carbon cycle anyway. It's more hysteria than it. Well, it's just totally hysteria. Plus, Brazilians have the right to develop their own natural resources.
Says you. Okay. Not says the UN. So you have to talk to them, I guess. All right. You can find a full debunking of this at climaterealism.com. That's Heartland's website that handles these sorts of things. So you can read it more in full, but that's kind of what we do. But with the time we have remaining, we want to get to as many questions as we can. So this is the part of the show that's usually everyone's favorite. Linnea, why don't you bring us through the Q&A?
Sure thing. Okay, so this is my favorite too. Not because I get to be in the big rectangle, but because we have a really fun audience and it's fun hearing from you guys. Okay, so our first question that we have here is regarding what we were talking about earlier with big oil. This is Bob. He says, if you don't get funding from big oil, why don't you sue them, being alarmists who claim that, for libel? And I think it's because that would be a very thin case. I think.
Yeah, you'd basically wasting your resources, your financial. You'd just be exhausting your money out for doing it. It's not really worth opening that can of worms.
You'd be chasing them forever. We don't want to be like our poor friend Mark Stein.
The irony is that we'd have to actually be funded by big oil to be able to afford to sue people for saying that we're funded by big oil. That's absolutely
yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, and this is from Energy Colonizer, who says, what are some good examples of price controls on utilities and energy leading to unnecessary rationing of such resources? I mean, the Soviet Union put in place price controls. I think that would be a pretty good example right off the bat. Anyone else got
controls on utilities? I mean, where do we have price controls on utilities? I mean, we regulate utility prices.
Yeah, I think it's referring to what Kamala suggested recently with some price controls.
Well, if you put price controls, anything you put price controls on, you get more scarcity of it. So if you want less energy, price controls is yet another of like 17 different bad policies that are restricting cheap energy use in this country. That would make it even worse.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's see. This is from our friend Albert. He says, there is currently a very big stratospheric warming event taking place in Antarctica. Could that push a lot of cooling into the troposphere and be a way of Earth naturally balancing the temperature? I think this is more of a Chris question. I don't know.
It depends on. Let me read the question real quick. Trying to figure out my best word of response. Not really. What happens in stratospheric warming events is if you get the polar vortex to split, it kind of just displaces. You get the higher temperature anomalies over the pole, so that energy will propagate down, and it will basically split the troposphere. So there's a stratospheric polar vortex, and then there's in the South Pole, it's called the circumpolar vortex. It's the same concept over Antarctica as it is the Arctic, and then you have a tropospheric counterpart. And that the stratospheric. So when you get a warming event in the stratosphere, the energy it's fluxes. It's very complex dynamics that it would take me hours to explain it on here, which I don't have time for. We've learned all about this, but in a nutshell, what happens is once you get that big warming event, it comes down to the troposphere and it splits the vortex. So you get these higher pressure areas, these big warmer relative to average areas over the Antarctic, but then in the periphery of the continent, what will happen is you get these much more colder anomalies. That's kind of how that works. So it's kind of like the Arctic. When you get the polar vortex, you get all the cold in the mid-latitudes over the United States or England, Europe, Russia, whatever. But you tend to have a much warmer relative to average Arctic during that particular period of time until it couples back together. So it doesn't really help reduce temperatures or cooling anything. It's more of a local effect.
Plus, warming is good. We like warming. Warming grows food.
Yep. You're on mute, Linnea.
Sorry about that. This is that's usually your job, Jim.
That's right.
This is from Chris Nisbet, who says, wouldn't a court like to see some evidence of these alleged climate change effects before it finds some entity guilty of causing them? Yeah, that's a good question.
You would think, but again, evidence doesn't really convince. If you have an activist judge, evidence isn't going to convince. I mean, have you ever, if it's like talking to a climate alarmist on Twitter or in person, that's always fun when you meet them in person at a protest. They've come to my campus and I told them, hey, I'm a meteorology major. Like, oh, we need you. I'm like, not so fast. So it's always, if you get an activist judge, I don't think no amount of evidence is going to convince them. They have already determined what they're going to rule a lot of times before they see the evidence in these cases, in my opinion. Steve would probably be a better person to answer this question. I'm curious what Steve has to say.
Well, it's just all, presenting scientific evidence to federal judges, to judges in general. I remember when I was in college, I was a science major. We used to laugh at people that were like economics majors or, pre-law, something like that. We thought they were stupid. Everybody who was smart was in science. And it's really turned out to be true. I mean, you get to judges start dealing with science, man, they just implode.
Yeah, I think kind of the angle that I would take on it would be, yeah, it really would be nice if judges would just throw these cases out right out the front door immediately, because they don't have any proof that there is a catastrophe being caused. Like, it would be like going to a court and saying, I would like to sue Exxon for murder. And they say, where is the body? And they say, well, we don't have one. But we're going to suggest that maybe these people who died of heat stroke in Somalia, that's Exxon's fault.
All these climate cases are going to fail when they get to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is going to determine that these are all ultimately political questions that need to be resolved politically. They're not capable of being resolved judicially. So that's what's going to happen in the end.
Right. Okay. I'm going to grab this question from our friend Stan Goldenberg, who says, Linnea, what makes you think they won't send us to jail? Getting more and more desperate and radical in their actions. I think it's unlikely, but based on what we've seen out of the UK recently, I would not say it's impossible, because we seem to be just a couple years behind them when it comes to our freedoms getting stripped. So who knows? Thanks for the cheerful idea to plant in my head, Stan. Okay. This is from our friend Kite Man Music, who says, question, is there a tipping point for the climate warming hoax?
Yeah, it's going to be on what's November 5th or 6th, whatever. That's the tipping point.
That could be the time if we should do so. Yeah. Good one.
I don't know the answer to this question, but Terry Barnes asks, didn't Exxon come up with the idea of a carbon footprint? I've heard this floated before, but I've heard similar things floated before.
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you.
Don't have
I
very
don't know
much
where that.
backing.
I'd have to look into it.
Right.
Why would they come up with that?
Well, I've heard the theory that I've heard is that Exxon or someone like that came up with the idea of calculating your personal carbon footprint in order to like disperse the guilt of climate change or whatever.
Yeah, if you're a size 13, it'd be much worse than a size 10.
Because they made us in when I was in middle school, we had to calculate our carbon footprint, and the teachers would tell us like, you shouldn't be. Do you flush your toilet every time you use it? That's something that's going to add to your carbon footprint. Do you do this? Yeah, that's literally one of the examples they gave. It was horrifying, and so all the students in the class looked at our teacher and they're like, "Do you not?"
In California, when Jerry Brown was governor of California, they had a policy to save water. It was like, if it's yellow, stay mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. So hard to gross you all out.
And on that note, I would be remiss if I didn't mention today's Washington Post story reporting that every time you flush the toilet, you may be flushing bacteria as high as 5 feet into the air. So there you go.
You better not end on that question. We need something better, Linnea. Let's go.
Yeah, well, no,
what
we
a way to dampen the mood there, Steve.
Yeah. Okay, let's go. This is a good one from Bogus, who says, if the atmosphere can't warm the ocean, wouldn't that mean higher CO2 absorption of solar energy would actually cause the oceans to cool? And I think that some of our panelists are going to have a problem with the first part of this question.
If the
Probably
can't warm the ocean.
I think the beginning to answering this question is to say that the atmosphere can warm the top layers of the ocean.
Atmosphere warmed by the sun.
The atmosphere only the long wave only penetrates like the top 1/100th of a meter. Or 1/100th of a millimeter, something like that. It's very small, so it doesn't really warm the ocean. It physically doesn't warm the ocean.
And the rest of it.
Can you put it back on the screen?
Yeah, I lost it. I
was a little confused by the second part of the question. But I agree with Steve on the first point that the infrared radiation that penetrates the first few like micrometers of water.
Yeah.
Over a long period of time, probably has an effect. The ocean gets heated from the top down, but the ocean gets heated mostly by sunlight because the sunlight can penetrate into the depths. So that's how it gets absorbed. The infrared radiation, there's very little conduction between the air and the ocean. It's much more sunlight driven than infrared.
I apologize, Bogus. I accidentally unstarred the question as I took it off the screen, and so now I cannot find it again. We have time for another one real quick here.
We have time for a couple more. Yeah, we don't want to shift our viewers here.
Chris Nisbet again. How much has the trillions we've spent so far changed the global average temperature?
None.
I knew there was an easy one in there.
Rapid questions here. Okay. From Terry Barnes, considering there's only a few atmospheric CO2 monitoring stations on Earth, do we have a comprehensive view of how homogeneous CO2 is within the atmosphere?
I think it's pretty homogeneous. We talked about this in my introductory meteorology courses. They're pretty good estimates, especially from the Mauna Loa Observatory. CO2 is a pretty well mixed gas in the atmosphere. There's higher concentrations, obviously, in the mid latitudes, especially over the U.S. and China in particular, especially over in China and India. But it's overall wind currents, everything over time. It's a pretty well mixed gas. You can probably find similar concentrations roughly everywhere, other than probably the higher latitudes.
But it would be interesting to see something more than just Mauna Loa, so we could.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely agree.
Over agricultural areas, it's probably a lot different than over deserts, and it's probably well mixed in the upper atmosphere, upper troposphere, and the lower. Who knows?
Okay, here's Bo put the second part of his question back up again. He said, Steve said the first part. Would it mean that more CO2 absorbing solar energy would in fact cool the oceans since less energy is reaching them? Oh, I see what he's asking.
More CO2 absorbing. So
CO2 can't absorb incoming shortwave radiation. It's transparent to that. It comes right through. So it would be CO2 only absorbs like infrared microwave part of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah, I know we have climate scientists and meteorologists in the chat. So Bo, you can maybe hang out a little bit, maybe get a even better answer to that for you.
Okay, next. How much realistic backup battery power would we need to give reliable baseload energy? When at a guess, do you think it would even be possible?
So David Wojcik of CFACT has done some work on this, and basically no. Trillions and no.
No. There isn't enough copper that we know where we can't find enough copper to do that. It's let alone all the other minerals that are necessary to building these batteries. No way.
Yeah, it's I think, as Steve mentioned, a couple different organizations, especially CFACT, have run the numbers, and just for the United States, it would cost trillions of dollars to do it with current battery technology. Now, a lot of what if you guys watch the show a lot, you know that one of my biggest complaints here is that we have a big group of people who work in industrial policy who are planning infrastructure around future technology that they assume is going to come about, like big innovations in battery storage that have not, or that either you can do it in a lab but don't work in real life at scale. Just because you can produce an experiment in the lab at a small level does not mean that that's scalable. And it's not just an economic function. Sometimes the physics just don't work out at scale. For example, and this is an economics problem, the cellulosic biofuels. That has been something that has been promised for decades and decades, that we're going to have a big breakthrough in cellulosic biofuels. You're going to be able to make fuel from the leafy, the stem parts of plants, which normally you can't really do right now. They have tried it. They have done kind of artesian versions of this fuel, and it works kind of at that level, but not a single one of them has remained solvent, even with subsidies. So there are so many technologies that are kind of pie in the sky, cool ideas, but they don't work in real life. And you cannot plan infrastructure around that. And I would say that's the battery issue. Okay. Do we have time for another one?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Kite Man, again, he says, are urban heat island temperatures increasing? I think that was a typo, but I fixed it.
I
think both. I mean, it depends on how built up an area is, but the urban heat island can increase that way, and also it's spreading as the suburbs and urban areas spread. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem for global temperature.
Yeah, very much so, especially overnight lows.
Yep, and because those temperature stations that were planted there 30 years ago are now surrounded by suburbs, not necessarily skyscrapers, but
something that's actually about the urban heat island effect I wanted to touch on very briefly was that the climate alarmists always point out that the southwestern United States is warming, and they say, well, yeah, it is cooling in the eastern U.S., but the southwestern part's warming. I actually took a look at the data network there because I was curious as to why that's the case, and it turns out that most of the time there's a lot of long-term comprehensive, long-term weather stations in the central, eastern, northeastern, southeastern United States that go back 115 years or more. In the Southwest, there's very few stations that have been operating for that long period of time that have comprehensive temperature data that doesn't have a lot of missing days, that's in a rural setting. Most of the long-term stations in the desert Southwest are in very highly urbanized areas. Places like Albuquerque, places like Phoenix, Las Vegas. You look at the southwestern states, other than California, but Arizona, Nevada, Utah, a lot of those states, very few long-term stations that are not that are very, very few long-term stations that are rural. Most of them are very urban, and that's where most of the warming is obviously due to the urban heat island effect there.
Right. And Phoenix especially, that's a really good case study too.
Phoenix
You
and
can look at
Vegas
the data
in
there.
particular.
It is. It's actually famous for how strong its urban heat island effect is. I think there's something they calculated. It's something like a 20-degree difference between downtown and the suburban areas in any given day. 20 degrees, especially at night, the change is even more noticeable.
Absolutely. Even in DC, it can be very, very large. I remember watching, it was Fox 5 DC one night a few years ago in January. DC Reagan National was at 28 degrees. Manassas, which is just a few miles to the west, at 4 above zero. There was a 24-degree difference. So the urban heat island effect is very pronounced, and nobody ever wants to talk about it. They just want to say, well, it's already been accounted for in our adjustments, but no, it hasn't.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We have one more, and it's a little bit technical, I think. I'm not sure we're going to have the answer to it, but we'll give it a shot anyway. This is from Steve Young, and he asks, to melt land ice sheets, what must the air temperature be and for how long?
Is this a game? Can we guess? Can I say 31? Can I say 31 degrees or 33 degrees?
The temperature has to be net zero.
Yeah, I would imagine it has to be above
I don't know
freezing.
that actually. That's a good question.
But it might not have to be above freezing. It might have to do with
It
some.
also have to do with whether there's impurities in the water, because if there's impurities and stuff, it's not going to necessarily freeze or melt at 32 Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius. It depends. And I mean, it's largely fresh water, but there's always impurities in water that alter the freezing point just a little.
Well, that's it. That's my whole list I went through there, guys. So thank you so much for sticking around late.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you very much, Steve Milloy of junkscience.com. All the junk that's fit to debunk, and he's got it on junkscience.com. Chris Martz, what a pleasure to have you on today. You're from CFACT. You are a star on Twitter. Follow him at Chris Martz WX, which is what people use for weather. He's going to be a meteorologist. And you can contact me on Twitter and X at JLakely, also at Heartland Inst. And Linnea Lueken is at Linnea Lueken on X. Always visit heartland.org. Visit our Climate at a Glance website. Visit climaterealism.com. Visit energyataglance.com. And also, I want to thank our streaming partners, as I mentioned, Junk Science, CFACT, Climate Depot, and What's Up With That. Thank you all for being here on this wonderful Friday, and we will talk to you next week.